There exists a yellowed letter from the passage of almost 500 years, kept under 7 locks in the secret archives of the Vatican. It is not a simple piece of paper. In its fibers, ink mixes, tears, and tiny dark stains that, according to experts who examined it in secret, could be traces of human blood. That letter should never have been written. It is the confession of a girl of barely 14 years old, who on the night that history promised to turn her into a queen, lived an experience so brutal that her innocence was shattered forever. And in its place, a shadow hungry for revenge was born. Its author is Catherine de' Medici, a young Florentine who came to France as a key piece of a political chess game between kingdoms and popes. Convinced that her marriage would be the beginning of a life of prestige and power. But what awaited her in that bridal chamber was not love or ceremony, but a calculated spectacle of humiliation. That night flesh was wounded, but what was truly violated was her dignity. Between cruel whispers and hidden laughter, Catherine felt something tear inside her, an invisible thread that united her heart to the innocence of her childhood. And when that thread broke, in its place remained a knot of resentment, tight, unbreakable. The documents that come to light today reveal that that night was witnessed from the shadows by 23 people, high-ranking nobles, hidden behind cracks and secret passageways. They watched every moment as if attending a macabre theater. None of them could imagine that with time, they would pay the price for their unhealthy curiosity. Because one by one, throughout the years, all of them would die poisoned by the same woman whose blood tears they had seen flow that night. Later, it would be discovered that Catherine kept a hidden diary. Page after page, she wrote the name of each witness, noting with meticulous precision the date, method, and last gasps of each life taken. That wedding night not only made her a wife, but a strategist of hate, capable of transforming her pain into the coldest and most calculated revenge. And if now, while you listen to these words, you feel a chill run down your spine and a forbidden curiosity awaken in your mind, understand that you are not alone. Only 1 out of every 1,000 dares to keep listening until the end of this story. The rest prefer to live deceived by official history. To understand the scope of that tragedy, we must mentally travel to October 25th, 1533, when the Palace of Marseille dressed in gala and aromas of a royal feast. Outside, the streets overflowed with music, wine, and curious people celebrating the union between France and the powerful Medici family. Inside, in the most guarded corridors, a very different scene was being prepared, one that would never appear in official chronicles or ecclesiastical sermons. Documents discovered centuries later in the Vatican archives speak of a secret practice known as purification ceremony, a medieval tradition that the French court applied only to foreign brides, under the pretext of cleansing them of any impurity foreign to royal blood. This ceremony was not written in any register. It was transmitted orally among the oldest members of nobility, almost like an oath shared in whispers and cups of wine. Catherine, with her 14 years just completed, had no idea what awaited her. The young woman walked that night through the stone corridors, illuminated by torches that cast disturbing shadows on the tapestries. Her hands sweated under silk gloves, and although her face maintained the serenity that the nuns of St. Lucy had taught her, inside she felt a slight tremor. She believed she would live her first intimacy like any wife of noble blood, without imagining that she was about to face a ritual designed not to unite, but to break. In the bridal chamber, Henry of Orleans, barely 15 years old, waited for her. Physically strong, but mentally molded, He was completely under the influence of Diana de Poitiers, his 34-year-old lover. Diana not only controlled his impulses and decisions, but had meticulously planned every gesture and word of that night, ensuring that the humiliation would be total. Henry, obedient like a puppet, would follow instructions to the letter through secret passageways built to spy without being seen. 23 members of the French high nobility settled in to witness the scene. They looked through hidden cracks with eyes bright with morbid expectation. Some drank slowly. Others murmured bets about how long it would take the young Italian to collapse. They were not mere witnesses. They were active participants in a cruel tradition that had been repeated secretly for generations. What followed exceeded any imaginable limit. The first caresses were a deception, a trap to lower guard. Soon, physical and psychological violence took over the room. Catherine screamed in Italian, begging for mercy, but her pleas were drowned between laughter and comments muffled by the wall. The trauma was so intense that her delicate blood vessels around her eyes broke, causing a rare medical phenomenon. Hemolacria, tears mixed with blood. Henry alternated moments of feigned tenderness with brutal attacks, deliberately prolonging the suffering. 3 times during the early morning, the court physician, Anand Dubois, was called to revive her when she lost consciousness. Each time she opened her eyes, the shadows of the watchers seemed to get closer, like vultures watching their prey. When dawn finally came, the Catherine who had entered that room no longer existed. In her place, something new had emerged. A woman who had memorized every face, every voice, and every laugh that resonated in the penumbra. A being that with time would turn that humiliation into a deadly weapon against all present. That gray dawn in Marseille did not bring relief, but a new form of existence for Catherine de Medici. The girl who had crossed France with timid dreams and youthful hopes had disappeared. In her place emerged a woman who, although still dressed in silks and lace, carried in her eyes a coldness that no courtly tutor had seen before. For days, Catherine barely spoke. She walked through the palace corridors with slow steps, listening, observing, memorizing every detail of the people around her. What no one understood was that her silence was not the result of fear, but of calculation. The humiliation she had suffered had crystallized into an unbreakable purpose, to return one by one each pain inflicted inside her. The education received at the convent of St. Lucy acquired a new meaning. There she had learned Latin, philosophy, history, and even rudiments of the alchemical arts that her maternal aunt practiced in secret. Since 12 years old, she dominated 5 languages and understood the intricate political networks of Europe better than many veteran diplomats. She had also studied the use of medicinal herbs, infusions, and extracts that could heal or kill. What before were academic knowledge now became tools for a plan that she would weave with the patience of a spider. Her husband, Henry of Orleans, barely noticed the change. He continued under the spell of Diana de Poitiers, convinced that Catherine was simply a docile wife without ambitions. But Catherine had learned a crucial lesson. Never show her true intentions until the moment was perfect. At court, she smiled when she should smile. She accepted minor humiliations without protest and cultivated strategic friendships. All while in the deepest part of her mind, she kept alive the map of her revenge. In the years that followed, Catherine began to gain influence little by little. She took advantage of banquets, celebrations, and audiences to listen to rumors, detect weaknesses, and strengthen ties with key people. Meanwhile, in the solitude of her chambers, she kept a secret diary. In it, each name of the 23 witnesses of her wedding night was written with black ink, accompanied by precise annotations. The gestures they made, the words they pronounced, the position in which they were hidden. It was not a simple record, it was a condemnation list. In the eyes of the court, Catherine continued to be the young Florentine who had learned to adapt to French customs. But inside her grew a silent power, fed by the memory of pain and the certainty that someday the scale of justice would tip in her favor. And when that moment came, there would be no plea or mercy to stop her. 3 years passed before Catherine moved her first piece on the board of her revenge. During that time, she had observed with patience, cultivating the image of a compliant wife, harmless, even fragile. But in the intimacy of her chambers, each night she opened her diary, reviewed the names and perfected the methods she would use to erase one by one the 23 witnesses of her humiliation. The first name on the list was Jean de Montmorency, a haughty courtier who on the wedding night had suggested between laughter betting on how long the young Italian would resist before collapsing. Catherine remembered with clarity the flash of cruelty in his eyes, the way he drank wine while watching her suffering. Now, 3 years later, that memory would transform into sentence. The poison that Catherine chose was not common in the secret laboratories she maintained in one of the least frequented halls of the palace, a space that officially served to store medicinal herbs. She had developed a precise mixture of hemlock and mercury, perfected through months of experimentation. This combination provoked violent convulsions, pink foam in the mouth, and prolonged agony that could last hours. Exactly the same symptoms she had endured that night. Jean de Montmorency was found dead in his chambers, one cold winter morning. The court whispered about possible food poisoning, but Catherine knew the truth. Before he drank the fatal cup, he had received a small crystal bottle with a dark red liquid and a brief message so you remember what you saw. That would become the personal mark of all her vengeances, her blood tears preserved as symbol and warning. In the following years, deaths continued, always following the same pattern. Victims were chosen with surgical precision, and no suspicion fell on Catherine. They murmured that the court was cursed, and that an invisible shadow collected the lives of nobles one by one. But no one could imagine that that shadow hid behind the queen's tranquil smile, weaving a web of death with the patience of one who knows that revenge is a dish served cold. Each murder was for Catherine an act of poetic justice. It was not just about killing, but about meticulously recreating the suffering she had experienced. And with each name crossed out of her diary, she felt she recovered a piece of her stolen dignity. Among all the names written in Catherine's secret diary, one shone with different hatred. Diana de Poitiers was not just a witness, but the intellectual architect of the humiliation. It was she who devised the ritual, who trained Henry of Orleans to execute every gesture and every word with cruel precision. Her influence over the young prince and later over the king was absolute. Catherine knew that bringing her down would not be an impulsive act, but the masterpiece of her revenge. Unlike other victims, Diana would not die quickly. Catherine chose a much more subtle and prolonged method, slow poisoning, invisible, almost impossible to detect. For months, small doses of toxic substances were mixed in her food and drinks, always in such minuscule amounts that they did not raise suspicions. The poison not only deteriorated her body, but also her mind. Day after day, Diana felt how her strength faded, how her reflexes became clumsy, and her memory began to fail. Catherine attended all banquets where her enemy was present. She, watched her drink from her cup with a courteous smile, exchanging glances charged with meanings that only they understood. It was a silent duel, a resistance game in which Catherine controlled every movement. No one at court suspected anything, because for everyone the king's favorite continued to be the radiant woman she had been for decades, although her eyes were already beginning to lose their shine. Finally, at 66 years old, Diana de Poitiers died after drinking wine offered by Catherine herself. The rudimentary autopsy for the era revealed progressive deterioration of internal organs, as if an invisible poison had worked on them for a long time. Catherine had replicated in her enemy the same prolonged suffering she had endured since the wedding night, but multiplied by years of slow agony. Meanwhile, other victims on the list fell one after another. Some were courtiers who had bet on her resistance that night. Others women who had participated in her degradation with mockery and poisonous comments. All received before the end the same macabre present, a small crystal bottle with dark red liquid and a brief note. It was her signature, a reminder that Catherine never forgot and never forgave. With time, palace corridors filled with rumors. They said that the court was cursed and that a blood curse weighed on those who had been present at that forbidden ritual. But the truth was much simpler and at the same time more terrifying. It was not about a curse, but about the iron will of a woman who had turned her humiliation into an unstoppable weapon. In Catherine's list, there was a name that always remained at the end as the key piece that would crown her revenge. Henry II, her husband, the man who had executed the humiliation that wedding night, while the shadows of 23 witnesses projected on the stone walls. He was not just any target. He was the King of France, and his death could not be precipitated or ordinary. It had to be symbolic, a perfect closure for more than 2 decades of silent retaliation. On July 10, 1559, Paris celebrated a tournament in honor of the peace signed with Spain. The square was packed with nobles, ladies, and commoners anxious to see the king demonstrate his prowess in jousting. Henry, confident and haughty, agreed to face Captain Gabriel de Montgomery in a friendly duel. Catherine, from the royal box, watched with an impassive face, but her eyes followed every movement with a concentration that few could decipher. When the lances clashed, a fragment of Montgomery's pierced the visor of the royal helmet, embedding itself in the monarch's eye. The crowd held its breath. The doctors rushed, but could not prevent the king, gravely wounded, from struggling between life and death for 10 days. It was a prolonged and painful end, marked by convulsions, fever, and hallucinations. Symptoms that, according to modern analysis, could not be attributed only to the wound. Recent studies of the lance tip, preserved as a relic, revealed traces of an unknown organic substance, possibly coated before the combat. A toxin that would have accelerated the king's deterioration and multiplied his suffering. It could never be proven that Catherine was behind that. But in Henry's tomb appeared carved a strange symbol. 3 interconnected circles crossed by a vertical line. The same one that Catherine had drawn with her own blood on the wall of the nuptial chamber that night of 1533. For her, Henry's death was not just the culmination of a plan, but definitive liberation. With that final act, she closed a cycle of more than 20 years in which she had converted humiliation into a weapon and pain into absolute power. There were no living witnesses left of that night. All, without exception, had fallen. Catherine, the young woman who once cried tears of blood, now stood as the most feared woman of the French court. The story of Catherine de Medici might seem by itself one of the most elaborate and ruthless vengeances in European history, But the reality is that her case is only one piece in a much vaster and more disturbing puzzle. The secret archives of the Vatican, opened to the public after 500 years of secrecy, reveal that she was not the only woman of royal blood who transformed humiliation into a lethal weapon. Among the documents stand out the lost diaries of Mary Tudor, better known as Bloody Mary. What official history recounts as a reign marked by bloody executions barely scratches the surface of what her personal writings reveal. Secret rituals, torture practices so refined that public executions seemed like acts of mercy in comparison. Her obsession was not just punishment, but meticulous suffering designed to break the will long before death arrived. Also appear the coded letters of Isabella of Bavaria, Isabel Buttery in the Latin transcription, describing alchemical experiments with corrosive and narcotic substances that converted her prisoners into subjects of prolonged tests. These experiments, hidden under the excuse of medical investigations, were actually trials to create the perfect method of torture, one that would keep the victim alive long enough to extract every secret and every possible scream. And among the most disturbing manuscripts are found those of Lucrezia Borgia, although legend already paints her as a master of poison. The recently deciphered texts show formulas of such sophistication that modern scientists have not yet managed to reproduce them completely. These were compounds capable of mimicking natural diseases, causing deaths that went unnoticed even by the most experienced doctors of the era. Each of these women, like Catherine, was molded by pain, betrayal, or abuse, and responded not with submission, but with a power that history tried to silence. And although the names of many of them were erased from chronicles and official portraits, their traces remain hidden in the darkest basements of European archives, waiting for someone brave enough to bring them to light. If this story has ignited in you the same thirst for truth as in us, you must know that what we have told today is only a fraction of what hides behind the velvet curtains and stone walls of medieval royalty. There are secrets that once heard cannot be forgotten, and others that perhaps we should never discover. Tell me in the comments what other queen or historical figure you want us to investigate. Your choice will decide what forbidden secrets we will reveal in the next episode. Because if Catherine's story seemed dark to you, what is coming will make this seem like a simple children's tale.